Thank you so much. Good evening. Sorry we're a couple minutes late. I'm the president of Search for Common Ground. We're a dedicated peace-building organization, and we're thrilled to be with IFC Entertainment, Nick, and the extraordinary people behind this film. So I love this film for a lot of reasons. I've been a peace builder my entire career, and there's so much in this film that's rich for people in my profession. There's been, I know, some debate around the film, how accurate. Things I want to start with, Nick, the film, it's about politics, but actually in the film they don't talk about any of the negotiating points. In fact, the only thing that comes up in the film around the contours of the actual agreement is you're going to be first minister and I'm going to be deputy first minister, and that's not even negotiated. That's already been agreed, basically. It's all about personalities. And that is how peace building so much happens. And so if you all don't mind, I'd like to actually get a bit to the personal level with you all. Because Colm, you were, where were you born? You were born in Dublin.
I was born in Dublin, yeah.
And Timothy, you were born in London, is that right?
South London.
South London, Battersea.
Yeah,
is that right?
Yeah, Battersea.
Yeah. And Nick, you were born in Belfast. Yes. So we've got sort of the microcosm of the different parties to the conflict on this stage. And so I'd like to maybe just start. And where were you born? Can I ask?
I was born just outside Belfast.
Just outside Belfast.
Yeah.
So for you all growing up, how live was this conflict? How were there arguments with friends? And did how the conflict play out in your own lives growing up? What kind of impact did it have on you, either wanting to do this film or maybe give you pause before you decided to do this?
Especially the early days of the conflict were very, very, very live for me. The early 70s through the 70s, when probably it was at its most violent. And I think for everybody in Ireland at the time, both north and south, it was. I mean, there were daily atrocities that you could see. And yet there was constant debate about what is the solution, what do we need to do, So it was a very very lively time. And in terms of, I later, as it sort of settled down into a sort of a constant kind of low level insurgency or whatever, and I had moved away from Ireland. It sort of faded for me into the background a little bit, but I was constantly aware of it, and I think in many ways for people in Ireland it faded into the background as well. I think people in the south became very apathetic about it, which was dreadful, because it is a problem that exists in our country.
But I think that's when conflict becomes normal, and it becomes boring. And it becomes like the norm, then it's at its most dangerous. When you accept it as the normal way of behaviour, which Colm's talking about, people in the South would just basically shrug their shoulders and go, well, it's a problem in the North, and people in the UK would go, the bloody Irish, and they were sick of it, and they don't want to know about it. And I think that's kind of, in the end, what happens to any awful war, that we kind of accept the inevitability of the normality of that situation. And that's in itself terrifying, that we accept atrocity as normality.
Well, Nick, I've heard you speak about this film, the impetus behind this film for you. My understanding is this was actually quite it was artistic certainly, but there were some political messages that were important to you as well. Can you talk a little bit about them?
It's very simple. I mean, look, this was a relationship that was real. We might have fictionalized what happened, but those guys actually did something, and they changed history. And in changing history, they stopped people killing each other. Period. That's a fact. And we can debate the fictionalization or how we did this or how we did that, but that's actually what they did. And I think in a world in which we live, I don't know, I wanted to celebrate that. I wanted to basically celebrate that friendship. I thought this was a completely unique contemporary political friendship that had resulted in a massive change in what was actually going on in Ireland. And it was sort of unknown outside, certain circles. So I wanted to establish that and say, look, this is what happened. But more importantly, I wanted to say, look, for God's sake, where are we? We live in a world now in which, and the left is as bad as the right. There's a world of total intransigence in the way that we behave, in the way that we think about politics, in the way that we conduct ourselves. We watch our own social media, we look at our own TV channels, and these two men, in order to achieve what they did, betrayed the very base that was supporting them. And in a world in which politicians are consistently derided, are portrayed as kind of craven, power-seeking, corrupt individuals out for their own betterment, this is a film that says, look, these are two politicians that actually succeeded in doing something and reached out beyond themselves and did this. And my God, do we need that now?
No, it's a good point, and it actually it sort of elevates Abby, please come up. That's great. Thank you. I knew we were missing a chair there. Abigail Disney, extraordinary. Yes, her reputation precedes her. Extraordinary producer and director of Media for Social Change herself, and a Search for Common Ground board member. So, this point about actually elevating politics, the honorable side of politics, and comes through loud and clear. But again, the film is so much about interpersonal relationships, and the writing of this film. I have to tell you, I know nothing about the side of the camera that you all work on clearly, but I have to think this is a pretty courageous film to make. The format of it, you can't hide any mediocre acting behind crashing cars and special effects. The acting has to be superb, and the writing, for somebody who works in conflict, there's so many turns of phrase and there's so many scenes in here that I was watching feeling like, yes, that's a dynamic you see in every conflict, whether it's a family conflict. Can you talk a little bit about what informed the way that you wrote this script?
Well, at the end of the day, I wanted to make it, a drama. It wasn't a documentary. I wanted to see the people behind the headlines and the politics. And the best way for us to do that really was to get them, in the back of a car, two complete strangers talking to each other. And how do strangers talk? They talk about the weather. They talk about, can you get a phone signal? It wasn't immediately into the big political issues. I really wanted to also address the whole, if you didn't live in Northern Ireland, you can't really understand what it was like. It's a very, very small country, but there was just such a huge amount of violence which affected every part of your life. Even if you went, to your local high street shopping, you would be searched going into the shops in case you were carrying a firebomb. And it's a mark of how peaceful we are now that now, I'm searched going out of the shop to see if I've stolen anything.
It's interesting to hear you talk about it, because if I can expose Timothy a little bit, but what we were talking about over dinner, and on the walk back, why are there no trash cans or bins in London? That's the other side of this equation. Is on the one hand, you're searched to see if you're coming in with the bomb. On the other hand, you talked about a little bit growing up and actually feeling like you were somewhat of a target.
Well, yeah, I did have to come to the conclusion, although what the guys have said, that it did become, I grew up with it, going on over in Ireland, and it was a massive pain in the arse. You watched it and you saw these characters, pouring seemingly, particularly in, I have to say, Dr. Paisley's case, the way he got his exposure and was exposed by, whether it was fair or not, was seemingly being vehement, but pouring, seemingly pour petrol on the flames of conflict. But then, it all seemed to be happening in Ireland, and then there was a bombing campaign on the mainland, and bombs went up, people were killed, and there was terrible things. So it became very one did feel like a legitimate target, and that's why there are still no trash cans on the tubes. There's still nowhere to put your rubbish. I was surprised that London isn't a filthier place, because there's plenty of places that, so that was a direct, banal, but a direct, a thing. Interesting enough, I was very guilty of, only having half an eye on it, and finding both the Dr. Paisley and Martin McGuinness kind of unpalatable characters, because of the way they were portrayed and the fact that it had become normalised. But just before this script came to me, I was starting to get my head around it in a far more objective point of view. So when this came along and afforded me an ability to look further into it, I was astounded by it and by the remarkableness of what was achieved, given that although we're talking about two opposing people with overcome this seemingly absolutely impossible impasse, we'd never get through it. I mean, to discover in such a small place the factionalism within the factionalism actually on both sides is quite remarkable. So just to find out how complex it was, given that it is such a tiny place, was a very interesting thing, and even more remarkable the fact that it was actually achieved. And Nick said it in sorry to go on, but one of the cruxes of this was having to come to terms with, these two men found themselves in this strong position by their intractability, by their fundamentalism, and they had to, as Martin McGuinness says to Dr. Paisley in this, we are going to have to betray our own, use positive betrayal to achieve this effect. They had to say to their people, we said we would never compromise, and this is the betrayal. We are going to compromise.
Well, thank you for actually picking out a scene, because I actually did want to go there. There are so many scenes in the film that just are poignant. They capture a dynamic that happens in pretty much every conflict at different, and if you're going to have a breakthrough, they become critical. Are there any scenes, for any of you actually, or Abby, even you having watched it, are there any scenes that for you were just particularly special for them, you felt that they captured something really dynamic? And I'd love to hear you. Nick, please.
I think the scene of the movie is the scene in the graveyard. There's no question that these two guys, I'm really kind of honoured to sit with both Tim and Colm, because I just think, look, you just watched a movie which is just two kind of rather strange old men in the back of a car, for 90 minutes. And, it's it's rather remarkable that both of them, convince you of so much kind of authenticity in that. And you watch the nuance of that, and so... You're right. I mean, and rightly so, they're being praised for that. But the scene of the movie is, and I think we'd all agree on it, is the scene in the graveyard. He goes, we all expect him to put his arm around him and go, poor you. And he just goes, fuck you. He just goes, you think you're going to get away with that? Really? In front of this? What we've been through? Paisley just turns it on his head. And that's where I think the audience just leans right into the end of the movie.
That was one of my favorites as well. I also thought that scene at the end, the apology, the non-apology. Paisley asks him to make an apology that won't even be public. Just apologize to me in this car, and we'll just get this done. And one of the things that we see in conflict dynamics at Search for Common Ground, anybody who's dealt with conflict, that the thing that actually costs the least in terms of money or resource or whatever, an official apology, always comes last or never at all. It was 45 years after Japanese internment that the U.S. government issued a formal apology. It was 60 years after the Tuskegee experience Tuskegee experiment, that an official apology, and we see because people's entire self-worth and identity is based on their position. So to apologize is actually to destroy this all. And I thought your character McGuinness in the car basically put words to that really beautifully. It was an extraordinary scene. I thought.
Yeah. A scene that for me I found incredibly affecting in the playing of it was the scene in the church where we're examining the stained glass panels, because Tim's performance was extraordinary, and I was constantly surprised by him, and in that he almost every take as well he would play it slightly differently, and but I was constantly, and most of that scene I listen a lot in that scene, and I really do listen sometimes, but the what Dr. Paisley says in that scene really changed. It gave me an insight. Tim's performance gave me an insight into something I did not understand literally all my life, which is what is this fundamentalism, this evangelical fundamentalism. I don't understand it. I don't know where it comes from. And I got glimpses of understanding in that scene. That's me personally, not just as the actor. And that I found that was extraordinary to me.
You've had the reactions to the film have been quite positive, have they not? I mean, both in Britain, in Ireland, and you screened it with children in Belfast, I think you just talk a little bit about the the reactions. Have they surprised you at all? Are they deeply emotional? I mean, this conflict, this is recent. I mean, it's 2006 we're talking about. It's not.
You know, what's fascinating is, look, we first presented the movie in the Venice Film Festival, which we were absolutely thrilled to do. And I think, we all turned up there thinking, oh my God, what's going to happen? And there's 1,000 Italians, all dressed to the nines, looking great, and better than us. And we were supposed to be on the red carpet, and they look fantastic. And then they started to laugh, and it's subtitled into Italian. And you think, oh my God, how the hell is this going to work? I mean, how are they going to understand this? And they started to laugh after 5 minutes, and then we had this enormous standing ovation. And then we took it to Toronto, and the same thing. And our friends from IFC saw it there, and they had the same experience. It was this massive cathartic response. But what happened was that we took it to Belfast a month ago, and Colm and Tim and I did this screening as part of the opening night, which was 1,000 people watching the movie in different screens. And one of the screens was sort of paid audience plus some of the politicians, and they'd done a really good job in supplying both sides. In other words, they brought senior politicians from Sinn Féin and senior politicians from the other side. And the movie ended, and you could feel there was first of all, they stood up, and we were like, oh my God, thank God. Because they understood, and because if you can't play it there, you can't play it anywhere. I mean, you can't play it to you. We want to play it in America. We think it's incredibly important that it plays in America. We want the American audience to embrace it and take it forward. But unless you play it in Belfast, you can't do that. And there was a sort of moment after the movie, and it was obviously very emotional for people, and there was ex-hunger strikers in the audience, and there was ex-IRA members in the audience, and there was really people who had obviously suffered in the audience. And this one man got up, and I think Tim and I, to this day, will never forget it. He stood up, and he just started talking about his sons, and how his sons had escaped, and how it changed. And the audience started to cry, because they realized this was real. It wasn't a movie. It was actually real. And that was the difference. And there was a moment, and I think Tim and myself and Colm I've done theatre, television, film. And I've never, ever seen an audience respond like that to any piece of work.
I mean, this is one of the reasons I was so honored and pleased to meet you all, because in addition to just being an excellent film, you all, the conflict is not, this happened quite recently, this breakthrough. There are still discomforts and tensions. The recent election is causing some bubbling questions again around what will hold and what won't. And in just talking to you all a little bit before being here, this was much more than just there's some personal elements to this that are very powerful to me. I want to actually, Abby, bring you in, because Nick just talked about the importance of showing this in the U.S. and and the sort of the personal element of this and how relevant it is. You've made a living making films for social change, and your most
Actually,
recent
I
film.
don't make a living at it, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah. Fair enough. Someone told me the best way to make a
Quite the
small fortune is to start with a big fortune and make films. Your most recent Peabody-nominated documentary, Armor of Light, took you on a journey to meet and deeply get to know, and you've now become, if I can say so, lifelong friends, deep friends, with one of the most prominent evangelical pro-life activists, ministers in this country. An issue that for you is I know, deeply personal and emotional and meaningful. I'd love you to reflect, connect what happened here and then bring the end to the troubles with what's going on in this country.
Oh, it's so connected. I really want Americans to see this film because each of those characters carries as much conviction, I think, as so many people on Facebook on each sides of it. I mean, everybody seems to be having staked out these polar opposite positions. And the shooting yesterday really messed with all our heads, right? Because the guy turned out not to be the shooter it always is. It was a Bernie bro. And all of a sudden, the conservatives are telling us about our language. And, they can be disingenuous all you want, but they're not wrong. They're really not wrong. And so for once, we really do have to stop and consider our language and take responsibility for ourselves. And it'll be interesting to see whether there's soul searching or not. But I went and found Rob Schenck because he was as far across the spectrum politically from me as he could possibly be. And I've watched groups of women and peace builders around the world. That's what they do, right? They go to the person that makes them feel the most uncomfortable, and then they just start a conversation. And that it's the fear of that is so enormous. And now that I'm friends with Rob, I'm trying to figure out what the fear was based on. Did I think he was going to hit me? Did I think he was going to... What exactly was I afraid of, exactly? And I wonder if, to a certain extent, I was afraid of agreeing with him, or afraid that I might not be right about everything. Or I do think that at the end of the day, that's what Ian Paisley and Martin McDonough find out about themselves, is also Martin McGuinness, sorry, is that they're not all as right as they thought they were, and they're not all as wrong as everyone else thinks they are. That the deepest, most entrenched conflicts are the ones where everybody's got an axe to grind, legitimately. Everybody's been wronged. Everybody has a reason to continue to carry this grudge. And what it takes is people to rise above the grudge. And to say, yes, I'm angry, and look at Fox's Book of the Saints. Look at what you've done to us, but maybe we can put that behind us. And that was how I approached Rob. I said, I've Googled you, you've Googled me, we could fight right now. We could just get right into it, or we could just choose to put aside this thing that I know you feel really passionately about, so do I. Just put it aside. And what if we just decided to spend some time on the ground that we share instead? Just choose it. And I guarantee you that if we talk long enough, we're going to find out that the whole reason we're on the opposite side of that police tape is because we're more alike than different. And I think that is almost always true in these intractable conflicts. I think that that at the end of the day, we find out that we're mirror images of each other. So there's an enormous amount of moral courage in what they did. I mean, not just because they betrayed their bases, although that's a very big piece of it, but I think also in terms of what they faced in themselves, in taking the step off their positions. I think it's the hardest thing in the world to do.
Well, that is a thing that I find, now it's played out and we see it, that this, the simplest shared humanity, the simplest understanding of, instinctive understanding of the fragility within this vehemence, which is, it might be slightly poetic or slightly romantic, but this sense, this shared humanity that we can find, exactly what Abby was saying about, which is really, kind of one of the only many different you work in all the time, but it is a common understanding of this. And the reason they find each other and laugh so much at each other is they know to a certain degree how outrageous both of their demands are, I think, to a certain degree, how much they stuck by it so much that they look at each other and what Abby says, they recognise they're very similar. They're very similar people, and it is through that similarity, although they have absolutely conflicting senses of what is right and wrong, they do achieve on a human level, without losing any of their principles, a connection.
Well, I just have one more question, and then we'll open it up for just a couple questions from the audience. But picking up on this, and frankly, picking up on the model, Abby, that you've set. I'm not trying to break news here. You don't have to say who, but as you all think about this, you played these parts now. Are there, when you think about in your own lives now, are there people, the equivalent of the Paisleys for you now, Colm, or the McGuinnesses for you that you cannot stand, or you could, and would this film experience, would this experience of being perhaps inspired by this example, would it ever motivate you to maybe try to reach across, or are there not those people in your life?
I wish there weren't. No. I mean, the people come to mind who are like that. I mean, at the moment we have Nigel Farage over there. We have Mr. Trump in the White House. We have the new partner of the British Prime Minister, Arlene Foster, in Ireland, who has taken up the position that Dr. Paisley had and doesn't seem to have quite his ability to manoeuvre. There's lots of people like that, and I would hope that the experience of making this film and thinking and understanding of the issues involved would make me more tolerant and more open, perhaps. I would hope so. Oh, shut up. Oh, shut up.
Completely more close. Absolutely, right? Joking.
I'm just finishing a documentary about the role of the women played in the peace process, in the Northern Irish process. And one of the things they did was they forced into the Good Friday Agreement things like integrated education, and I'm sure you know a lot about this, Norman, and mixed housing, and there were a number of different things that because the women were forcing them, they weren't seen as weighty or important, or because they were just women. When the women spoke at the peace talks, by the way, all of the guys on both sides of the conflict would moo like cows. And here are these guys who hated each other this much, but they could agree to that, that they would moo. But anyway.
But there's also true that when they were at the peace conference, the Sinn Féin and the DUP never sat in the same room.
Yeah.
Never, ever sat opposite each other against the same room.
So, but the Women's Party brought Protestants and Catholics together, and they were working the back groups and so forth. But none of that stuff has ever been acted on. And so there really hasn't been an active attempt at real reconciliation in Northern Ireland. There hasn't been an attempt to really address the root causes of the conflict. And so it feels very alive in Belfast now. You really do feel the conflict is very present and still right there in the air. And this is a really important part of it, because the generals agreed to the ceasefire and the politicians signed the peace agreement, but the people have to build the peace. That has to happen at the ground level. And so far in any of the peace agreements that the Americans have been involved in, and certainly in Northern Ireland, nobody's ever really invested in what it means to actually put the pieces into place for people to actually construct the peace from the ground up. And it would be interesting to see if just once we could try that, a surge that was civilian instead of military, that really constructed things like integrated education and water and housing and so forth. It would be amazing.
Yeah, this is, as you know, Abby, at Search, this is one of the primary things we see everywhere, that, you can't make peace without the governments, but you can't make it stick without the people, and you have to do both top down and bottom up. And, well, listen, my selfish personal hope for this film is that it inspires more people both government leaders to realize that they can actually make a historic change, but also regular people that they can reach across these divides, because we are losing a lot of faith that that's even possible, let alone willingness to go ahead and do it. And this is such an extraordinary film to encourage us to try that. So I'd like to just take maybe 2 questions. I've got enough time. Yes, sir. Right in front of me.
Did you guys have an opportunity to rehearse, or was the interaction developed as you did the takes? Because there's this point where you really see how you two settle into the characters, that the characters are there, not you. And
Can everybody hear in the back? Okay.
loud enough?
So was there a lot of rehearsal, or was this something?
And how was that process?
How was the process of settling into the characters? Yeah.
Yeah, we did. We had was it 2 weeks, Nick? Or
Yeah, I mean, they rehearsed quite, they rehearsed because they come at it sort of halfway up the ladder. I mean, they're both damn good actors, so that they're not rehearsing like what they should do. They're rehearsing how they should do it, and so that's always brilliant with an actor when you're watching in a rehearsal room. The choices that they make, and I think these 2 guys, when you take them into a rehearsal room, they kind of mumble and stumble and do terrible acting and look at each other, and you kind of know that actually they're inside, they're really just waiting for the camera. And they both, they charted out their journey, if you like. So there was rehearsal, yeah.
One more question. Yes. Mr. Ambassador, please.
It's a great film. Thank you very much for inviting me. I think it needs to reach out to a much wider audience, not only here in the West, but also in countries in the global South, some theater as well. Now, what we can say, I can't say how much was fiction, how much was real. But then we are talking about the actors and directors. But what about the facilitation, the people who orchestrate all this that is going to be in the show? Do you think that could be replicable in real life, in other parts as well? And if yes, would that take a different kind of orientation among the facilitators also? Interestingly, I'm saying this, I'm asking this question because interestingly, in developing countries where conflicts are there, facilitators always create for media attention, central focus themselves. This is the time when we need selfless
So-
mediators or facilitators.
Yeah.
Who have no interest of their own, but to achieve the goal of peace.
So the question from the former ambassador of Nepal to the United Nations is whether the role of the facilitator in this kind of a conflict resolution, that increasingly in certain countries facilitators are trying to take the limelight and step in, and when really what we need more of is facilitators who will allow the parties themselves to take the credit and be honored and be in the background. So I don't know, maybe from either in the script writing or in the direction, Nick, and kind of the decisions that you made around, you really wanted to focus on the 2 principles.
Look, here's the deal. Search for Common Ground. I actually worked with these guys for I don't know. I went and I did a little tour with them in Sierra Leone. I don't know, about 6-7 years ago. One of the things Search for Common Ground do is they build radio stations in Africa, and they work to produce and make dramas that preach about women's health, non-sectarian. I mean, look at the Rwandan struggle. That came from hate radio, what they call hate radio. In other words, go out and kill the Tutsis or kill the. So Search actually, dug down, built the bloody radio station in the middle, put a mast up, employed actors, wrote a script, and preached to because Africa works from mobile phones, no TVs, mobile phones, and as we all know, and the odd television they all gather around and watch the football. So the idea of radio becomes massively important. So facilitators are it. That's it. That's what you've got. You have to have that. And NGOs like Search, are just incredibly vital when it comes to that sort of work. And I think in your own country, we all know what's going on, and I think there's an awful lot of work there to be done.
I want to try an experiment and say, close your eyes for a minute. I actually really mean that. Close your eyes. And picture war. What does war look like to you? Do you know what the weapons look like? Do you know what the people look like? What is the landscape? What does it sound like? What does it smell like? Okay, you can open your eyes. Did you have a picture that was very vivid in your head? So everything that you know about it, unless you've been there, you got from Hollywood, right? And it feels incredibly real. And you are so persuaded of it, aren't you? And it's kind of pretty. It's kind of sexy. It's kind of alive for you. 65% of the media around the world that's consumed comes from the United States. And how many dead bodies do we pile up at the doorstep of country after country and in the consciousnesses and imaginations of young men and women everywhere in the world? So I really want to thank you, Nick, for making this film. Because, if I asked you to close your eyes and tell me what peace looked like, would you be able to conjure anything? We don't do that. And peace is harder, much harder to make, much harder to maintain, and much harder even just to imagine. And so without Nick and this film, I think, where would we be with an image of what it looks like to make peace? So as they do in marriage counseling, they don't help you get a healthy marriage by studying everybody who divorces, right? They got to study who the marriages to stay together. Likewise, you don't learn how to make peace by studying war. You learn it by studying peace. And so we need our media to take more responsibility for, first of all, for what it makes in people's minds, because it does drive conflict around the world. And then we have to really hold our own feet to the fire in terms of our media and what we put out in terms of peace. We need to have bigger, better imaginations and bigger, newer ideas. And I'm so grateful to you for making this film. Thank you.
Thank you. So with that, I want to thank you all for being here. A number of people to quickly thank here. Ambassador Donahue, the ambassador to Ireland, Ireland to the United Nations. Ambassador Batari of Nepal. The sponsors, Norman Houston from the Northern Ireland Bureau. Thank you, sir. And the people at the Ireland Fund. Pamela Robbins from the Consul General of Ireland. IFC executives and the entire team. Nick Hamm, of course. Colm, Timothy. You all, thank you so much for being here. Abby, and thank you all. Have a wonderful night.